Well, I'm here at the Evangelical Theological Society Conference in San Diego, California, and I'm here to ask some of the top apologists questions about God, faith, and apologetics. Let's get into it. What is one underrated reason to believe that Christianity is true?
Beauty, objective beauty in the world. There's still not a single apologetics book that makes the case for beauty. That might be because it's something you more experience than you logically argue for. But I think beauty in itself is a profoundly underrated and underdeveloped apologetic.
I love that. Sherlock Holmes makes an argument for the existence of God based on beauty.
Oh, let's go.
Yeah.
Okay, you would know.
Yeah, he says, look at the flowers of the field. Only minds create extra beauty. And it's like, you have much to hope for because of the flowers. So I love it.
Oh, I actually don't know if this has been explored, but is the culinary argument for God's existence. So I think great food and just that it tastes so much better than pure survival value.
Yeah.
Enjoyment gets right down to that numinous experience of goodness itself. Yeah. And so I think we could make a powerful argument from like a custard-filled donut for God's existence. There are
super abundance of deliciousness.
There are some recipes.
Angels obliqued from the new creation. Sun is still in trouble, but that now exists here on earth, and I just think it's great.
I love that answer because so many apologists are absolute foodies.
Yeah.
And so I think there's a connection there that
it's an easy one to make and one that is almost accessible to any person anywhere, irrespective of their background.
I love that.
I think a lot about the argument from reason.
Okay.
As a kind of underrated reason. So this idea that, right, the existence of logical principles point to the existence of God, because if you believe in a perfectly natural, physical, material world and that's all that exists, logical principles don't fit that category well. One way to sort of see the argument of reason is it at least expands the categories to this kind of realm of logical, moral principles, those sorts of things, which already gets you thinking supernaturally, if you like. And then the question is, how do we ground those principles? And I think it leads us to the existence of God. I think God ends up being the best explanation for logical principles. And then here's why it's so underrated, is that to deny the existence of logical principles completely undercuts your own view, because now you're saying reason doesn't even exist.
Yeah.
Right? Logic doesn't exist. And so try defending that logically.
Yeah.
I think there are lots of underrated reasons to think that Christianity is true, but one that's become especially relevant recently is that sort of the practical consequences and how it can sustain a society. Like the new atheists came along and they had set it up as almost like a scientific hypothesis that, hey, if we just get millions of people to turn away from Christianity to become atheists, then society is going to become the scientific utopia and so on. And what happens? Just people instantly start losing their mind. They end up accidentally paving the way for Islam and so on. And so you wouldn't want to say that something is true just because it works. But when you actually tack that on to all the arguments that we have and then say, oh, and by the way, it really, really, really works as far as holding a society together and giving it a kind of resilience against attacks from outside, I think that's underrated. And I think we're going to see a lot more of that in the near future.
Sort of the judge the tree by its fruits. And I think that's what brought Ian Hirsi to faith, of one of the reasons that.
And she said that to Richard Dawkins. She said, all your predictions about what would happen have not come true.
You know, I have always been convinced by the moral arguments, and it's kind of parallel an argument from beauty. I just think it's clear that when we begin thinking about the nature of morality, that you're going to find yourself at God very quickly. And even in an age where I think sometimes people avoid it because it's like, well, no one thinks there's, good and bad. You're like, everyone does.
Yeah.
And everyone acts that way. So I think there's actually a lot of grit to that. And actually, in many ways, the parallel argument from beauty, I think most people presuppose that we actually do have objectivity in relation to beauty. And that's distinctly meaningful in the fact that God himself is beautiful in the Christian tradition.
Wow. That's really good. A little C.S. Lewis mere Christianity.
That's right. Yeah.
It still works today.
Well, there's several underrated reasons, but I'm going to pick one that I thought of that I really love, actually.
Yeah.
And I often talk about this one all the time. And I think it's the eternal contemporariness of the Bible. This is a paraphrase from Leslie Newbigin, where he talked about Jesus being our eternal contemporary. that Jesus is, of course, an ancient figure who operated in a land far away in a time long ago, and yet everything he seems to say has eternal applicability. It always applies to our personal lives, but it always applies to the big issues of life and the big cultural issues now. So we talk about racism and sexism and things ending in phobia. And Jesus dealt with so many either of those things directly, or he dealt with things that are like the things we're dealing with today in ways that were groundbreaking and shifting. In fact, an atheist in Oxford who was talking to a former colleague of both of ours had said, even though he doesn't believe in God, he said, for some reason, Jesus is compelling because Jesus was not a product of his time. In fact, I would say that Jesus is a product of being timeless. In fact, the one through whom all time was made. So if you're looking for a reason that you haven't thought of, then maybe this is an answer to why Christianity is true. I would consider the fact that Jesus is, and the Bible generally, but Jesus in specific, is always relevant.
Wow, that's so good. I was just listening to a interview with Riley Gaines and Joe Rogan, and that was something that he was making this point, and so was she, that the Bible seems scarily accurate at describing what our needs are, what the world will be like if we don't follow God's ways. And he was saying, like, maybe there is something to this.
Yeah. Eternal wisdom.
So I think basically consciousness and or the soul. I think it's just because a lot of people have not been exposed to it yet. Yeah. But in academia, it's really making an interesting you could even say revival. Yeah. And it just hasn't trickled down to the popular level audience yet. But essentially, in a nutshell, if it can be shown logically that I am transcendent more than my body, more than my brain, then there must be something more than the physical material world. Yep. And the implications are profound, even ethically speaking. So, for example, one argument I would use for the soul in a nutshell is if we compare physicalism, just purely physical, or I'm something immaterial, you could start with that premise and say, I'm either a purely physical object or an immaterial soul. If I am a purely physical object, then let's say if you were to cut half my body, then I would technically only be 50% of a person. But intuitively, we know, no, I'm still 100% of a person, but I have 50% of a body. So if my body can exist in 50%, but I as a human being am still a 100% human being, then it follows I'm not identical or reducible to a body. This has implications for something like abortion. Just because the human person is inside the womb smaller, not as developed, doesn't mean they're any less of a person than I am. Same thing with end of life, same thing with brain function. If we're going to ground personhood in something, that if it's going to be in the brain or the body or the memories, then you are now making a spectrum of personhood, thus a spectrum of value. But if we're all equally value, well, then there must be something more to the physical world, namely something like a soul.
Wow. That's a great reason. And I think there's also all sorts of empirical arguments, near-death experiences. Sure, yeah. Those sorts of things. So, yeah, it's a great reason.